Welcome to the Gluten Intolerance Group's fourth quarter virtual education event. Tonight's topic is there gluten in that food? The ins and outs of testing. Consumers can now identify gluten-free products based on whether they are labeled or certified gluten-free on package, something that wasn't true even 20 years ago. So things have come a long way. And testing is one part of establishing that gluten-free status. It's not the only thing or everything by any means, but it is a part of it. And additionally, gluten testing is now available to consumers on an individual level. So clearly gluten testing is quite relevant to gluten-free consumers. So tonight we're going to really delve into it. We have a panel of 3 experts who will explain the details to give you a better understanding of how gluten testing helps to assure that your gluten-free foods are safe. And they'll also address some of the limitations of gluten testing, which are important to understand and keep in mind as well. We'll have about 45 minutes of a panel discussion, followed by 10 to 15 of Q&A. You may type questions into the chat. We'll be monitoring those as we go along, and we'll address as many as we have time for. And now I'd like to introduce our panelists. Justin Bickford is the scientific director at Elisa Technologies, where he works with staff, customers, and governments globally to help ensure products are free of gluten and allergens and to ensure proper labeling of meats, meals, and food products. Thank you for being here, Justin.
Welcome.
Luke Emerson Mason is the president and laboratory director at VIA Diagnostics, an independent ISO accredited contract testing lab specializing in food allergen and gluten analysis. He is responsible for ensuring the quality of test results, as well as researching and validating new methods and managing customer projects. Thank you too, Luke, for being here. Laura Allred is the regulatory manager for the GFCO certification program. Prior to coming to GFCO, she ran a private lab that performed gluten and allergen analysis and developed gluten test kits. Laura chairs the AOAC Working Group on Gluten Method Validation Guidance and serves on the AOAC Expert Review Panel for Gluten Assays. Thank you for joining us as well, Laura.
Thank you.
Okay, we will get started. I have a series of questions that I'm going to ask, and I'd like to have each panelist have the opportunity to respond, time permitting. So we'll start with that approach and sort of see how that goes. Luke, I'll start with you. What does it mean when a product is labeled gluten-free? And does it always mean that the product is tested? And how do you see the role of testing in gluten-free production? So I think a lot of people do think that every product is tested necessarily. Is that true?
No, definitely not. Certainly it depends on the risk involved with the ingredients or the manufacturing process. But obviously the FDA definition of gluten-free is less than 20 parts per million. And certainly if food manufacturers are following GIG, GFCO schemes, which Laura will, I'm sure, speak more about, there are certain testing requirements they need to meet based on the ingredients and manufacturing processes they're using. And it kind of varies a little bit. Obviously, there are other labeling schemes. They don't have to go through GFCO. A company could just put gluten-free on the label, but then you're really trusting their that they're doing their due diligence. You don't have a third party certifying that, which it could be dangerous depending on what the product is.
Yeah, thank you for that. Justin, would you like to jump in on that one as well?
I think that hits most of it. It is not always tested. It may be that the facility is purchased ingredients that are gluten-free certified or that have been tested to be gluten-free. It may be the facility is using ingredients that would be naturally gluten-free, and sometimes they may be making an assumption about it. I think a lot of people would like to think that everything is tested, but that's not the case.
Yeah, interesting. And Laura, maybe you can jump in and address a little more the last part of that question, which is, how do you see the role of testing in gluten-free production?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Luke and Justin, you guys have heard the phrase, you can't get safety through testing. You can't test your way to safety. Really, safety around gluten-free, around allergens, around anything is about all the processes you put in place to make that food safe. And testing is really just sort of a little checkpoint at the end, a little, picture in time at the end. And you better feel like you know how that test is going to come out when you run it. You should have already put all your processes in place to make sure that you're making a gluten-free or allergen-free product. So yeah, testing, very important. Obviously, we require it in our certification. Most companies that, make gluten-free claims do some kind of testing, but yeah, it's not the key feature in making gluten-free foods.
Yeah, good.
And I do have one other thing to add about the role of testing, which I kind of view testing for gluten or allergens as a complementary to microbial testing. A lot of companies are testing to make sure that there's no contamination that's going to make people sick from bacteria in their products already. So allergen and gluten testing is really just another layer of testing that they could be performing if that's something they're concerned with.
Yeah, good. Now, this next question really covers, I think, a lot of different aspects. So we may have to get back into some of what I'm going to ask, but I'll just read it all off to start with. Basically, what are some of the reasons why we might see different results from different gluten kits when testing the same sample? For example, do all test kits recognize wheat, rye, and barley equally? And if not, what are some of the differences? Why might you get a different result with a rapid kit versus an ELISA test? Should any positive result with a rapid kit be confirmed with an ELISA test? And actually, I think it would be really useful for one of you, you can just jump in to maybe give a super brief explanation of the basic difference between a rapid test and an ELISA test, since we're throwing around that terminology. Luke, do you want to jump in on that one?
I think Justin's a bit of an expert on the rapid test. But
Okay.
Well, we make both, so I'm kind of requirement that I have some familiarity with it. So the rapid tests are, for people that aren't familiar with what the tests are, rapid tests are a lateral flow test. A lot of people know them currently as COVID tests or pregnancy tests, same technology. All of the home tests are lateral flow tests. That's what they're all based on. So they're qualitative, they don't give you a number. They often are very simple to run. And that's something that people can do in a laboratory or at home or manufacture. ELISAs are much more complicated. They take much longer. There's a lot more you can do with them. So some products that you can't test by lateral flow, you can still test by ELISA. They require a lot more equipment. It's not something you can just run at home.
And so, yeah, I think so. One key difference.
Quantitative results also, they can tell you not just that gluten's present, but they can tell you how much is present, which is useful in troubleshooting for manufacturers a lot of time.
Right. So I think that really is a key thing to keep in mind. It's the yes, no versus an actual quantitative result. Great, thank you for that. So what about the question of whether all kits detect, all gluten sources equally, rye, wheat, and barley? And if not, what are some of the differences? Luke or Laura?
Speak a little bit to that, using several of the ELISA kits that are available daily. Obviously, it's going to depend a lot on the antibody you use, their reactivity to wheat, rye, and barley. Generally, monoclonal antibodies are used. And I'd say the biggest three are the scarlet, which tends to be more responsive to wheat, as opposed to the R5 antibody, which is more responsive to rye and barley, although it's calibrated to wheat. So, you can be testing for gluten, and depending on which grain is present, you certainly get different results. If it's rye or barley, you might get an exaggerated result by 2 to 3x.
So do manufacturers, choose their testing based on what they're actually testing always, or not necessarily, or how does this work? It sounds really
They certainly could, if they've done their homework and they want to research it. Generally, people just go with whatever accredited test kit the lab is running.
Okay.
12 antibody as well. So there's a few different options out there. It also depends on what they're calibrated to. It seems to be working. Generally, the rule is below 20 parts per million. I know GFCO looks for results below 10 parts per million to kind of bake in a some variability in there. So, even if you're underestimating a little, you're well below the 20 parts per million. But, to Justin's point, when he was talking about the qualitative versus quantitative results, ELISAs also have a much more robust extraction process. They're a lot more capable at handling different food matrices, and, generally the lab equipment is more precise than what you might be using at home. So certainly more reliable on the quantitative side.
So the differences could cause some sort of variability in results, but generally at the manufacturing level, not a huge issue, you're saying, it sounds like.
Well, it depends. Is often the answer.
Yeah, it's, as Luke pointed out, most of the kits are calibrated to wheat. And typically that's fine, because that's probably the most common contaminant you're going to get in foods. Where you tend to run into issues is in like commodity grains, particularly things like oats, where you might see barley and rye a little more often, and you might get a higher than expected result. If the antibody for that kit was made to rye or barley, it might be a little more sensitive in that way.
So is this, would that type of scenario be an example of when, additional testing would potentially be done with a different kit if that sort of thing came up?
Yeah, if somebody, so as Luke pointed, every kit is different. Every antibody has different reactivities. If somebody wanted to go through the effort of doing that confirmation, they could test with a different kit using a different antibody and compare those results. A lot of times we do find that using a different kit, we get very similar results. Despite the differences in the antibodies and the difference in the way the kits are put together, which personally is always very reassuring.
Yeah, exactly.
In the lab, when we're submitting results to a customer and they've asked for 2 different tests, and we look and they are within 5, 10, 20% of each other, the results, I feel better about it.
Yes.
But we do expect to see differences sometimes, just depending on what's being tested.
Yeah.
And you did have a good point at the end there, Lola. I heard the end part of your question about, lateral flows, and should you confirm those with a...
Right. I just wanted to get back to that. Yeah.
Definitely important. And a lot of times the rapid kits are a little more sensitive, because they're looking at them for catching issues, so they can be a little more sensitive sometimes than a quantitative kit. So even if the kit says, hey, we detect 10 ppm or up, sometimes it's seeing things down at 5 or 6. And we'll get that where a client will get a hit with a lateral flow strip, and then they send it out to a lab for quantitative testing, and it turns out to be, less than 10 or even less than 5 sometimes. So definitely follow up on those.
So just to clarify, the rapid kits are used not just by consumers, but they are used in industry as well, for sort of certain scenarios, like you were just saying.
Definitely, yeah. And not even in certain scenarios. They're used pretty widely. They're used for raw material screening, they're used for equipment, they're used for finished product. They get used quite a bit.
They're the cheaper, faster screening tool.
So should any positive result from a rapid kit be confirmed with a quantitative laboratory method?
For sure.
That depends on why you're testing. Most
Can
cases,
you
I would say
elaborate on that?
So there are some people, there are some facilities, there are some people that send us samples, and they are just interested in knowing that they cannot detect any gluten in their product. For many of those people, they don't need a confirmation. They detected anything at all, they're done. That's it. They're not going to sell that to a consumer. For people that are looking for that are specifically looking for a certification or making sure that they're under the FDA limit, yes, a follow-up test is almost always necessary in those cases. And we have customers, so there's some other issues that you come up with both in lateral flow and ELISAs of samples containing tannins and polyphenols or enzymes. Enzymes will cause a positive result on a lateral flow. And we have customers who test gluten-reduced beers. That's a common one.
Well,
there's ways to address it. There's ways to address it prior to testing, but most people aren't aware of that.
Right,
you can inactivate those enzymes and get an accurate result. But if you don't inactivate them, that lateral flow test is going to give you a really bright positive result.
Yeah,
And
and
it
then
doesn't mean
this
there's
was going to
gluten in
be
that particular case.
one of my next questions was why do the current methods not work for fermented or hydrolyzed samples? So yeah, you have started to address that. Anything else to add on to that, Laura or Luke?
Oh, just that certainly if a manufacturer is using a rapid test, testing their final product and they get a positive result when everything else they've done with their management system implies that it should be negative, certainly they would want to, send that in, or if they can in-house do a quantitative confirmation. Because sometimes kind of along the lines of enzymes, there are other things like Justin said, tannins and polyphenols that can interfere. Or something in the food matrix might make it extremely sensitive, well below 10 ppm. Mm-hmm. Just a few of the reasons why people would send samples in for confirmation testing.
Yeah, interesting. So clearly, I mean, it is extremely complex. I mean, as you said, the food matrix. So every, food is its own, its own entity and responds potentially somewhat differently.
Rarely are there even two gluten-free chocolate chip cookies made the same exact way.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Let's go on to so-called hotspots in testing. When assessing a sample for compliance with gluten-free labeling threshold, as we've been talking about, should an average of several results be taken to take into account hotspots? And maybe one of you can jump in and describe what hotspots are. Justin, you want to take that one?
Maybe. But I was looking at some of the questions you may be asking, like, so hotspots, depends on how somebody defines that. So the thing with testing and hotspots, the way I'm thinking about it is that no testing is perfect, and so you are going to end up with problems with sampling and homogeneity. So you may have a sample that has gluten in it, or a product that has gluten in it, and depending on where you sample from, you may have a negative result from the bottom of the package and a positive result from the top of the package. Mm-hmm. And so having those, that's why I'm doing hotspots. And so if something's not really well mixed, that can cause problems. It can cause hotspots like that. And so the problem with taking an average result is that the good and the bad of it is you could miss something that's there because you have a hotspot in a sample and you just kind of negated it with just more and more testing and then said, oh, well, we took an average and it's okay. So it's
what's the solution to testing when there are potential hotspots, or how do manufacturers deal with that issue, Laura?
They talk to their legal and quality teams.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, and averaging typically is part of it. I mean, you don't want to throw out, megatons of product because you sampled something that was 1/4 gram that came out kind of, above what you would expect. And, in most cases with these test kits, you are testing very small 1 gram, or sometimes I know, Luke, you guys will go up and do like a 2.5 or a 5 gram sample because you're trying to fix that homogeneity issue. Which again is a particular thing that we see in oats, that gluten is sort of very unevenly distributed. So, you don't want to get rid of a product because you get one sample of a very small, part of that product that comes up a little hot. So, typically you will do averaging to see if, on a serving size scale or something like that, if you're staying below that threshold.
So you mentioned oats, but what about other whole grains? What is the particular relevance of hotspots to testing whole grains generally? I'll let anyone jump in on that one.
They're kind of an issue in any whole grain. I mean, if you're, particularly if you're sampling them on a whole grain level, it's a lot harder to find that one wheat kernel among 1,000 wheat kernels than once you've made it into flour and it's a little more evenly distributed. So
okay, so yeah, that's the explanation. Okay, interesting.
I'd say one of the hardest things, for us is working with customers to determine their, proper sampling techniques, because it's going to vary depending on, how much product you're making, what your ingredients are. They could send in one package of a, 10,000 package production run of gluten-free pretzels. some customers could, if they're doing their own gluten-free labeling, and consider that enough, and it's really convincing people to, look into it and make sure you're doing statistically relevant sampling that then we can, do our statistically relevant sampling on, because we can only test what we receive,
Right.
Once it gets to us, it's kind of out of, we don't control the other 9,999 packages of product.
Yeah. And so just a little bit more on the whole grain question. You addressed this partially, but the different aspects of testing at the primary sample level, lab sample, and test portion levels. What are some of the various issues at those different levels of testing?
Yeah, it's like, go ahead.
Really quickly is, obviously we want to tell the customer to send in as large a sample as they can, take relevant sampling just from multiple spots in their packages. If they have several 50-pound bags, obviously hopefully take composite samples from several of those, send them to us. We might get a kilogram, would be a pretty large sample size, but, 500 grams to a kilogram, roughly a half to 2 pounds. We end up grinding, homogenizing maybe 200 grams of that into a flour and sampling a couple grams from that. So it's really important, if you're only ultimately going to be testing 2 grams from thousands of pounds potentially of product, that you get a representative sample in the lab.
And so again, that's just going to vary also by manufacturer, right?
Yeah, I think
what they send.
I think one of the big things Luke just hit upon is risk assessment. And so when it comes to a manufacturing line, making sure that it's not just the last product off the line. If there's contamination on a manufacturing line, oftentimes the first product would have a positive result and the last product wouldn't. So making sure that risk assessment, that risk management is there to say, where is our biggest concern? Let's make sure that we're hitting upon that, and then also doing our random sampling beyond it.
Yeah, but so
home users too, of making sure that you're not just testing the outside of this product that may have been contaminated in a shared oven, but also testing the inside to make sure you're capturing the ingredients that went into it.
Yeah, so the risk assessment, that just gets into, what was said at the very beginning, which is that all these other factors really go into making a product gluten-free, and the testing is just sort of a final check. So good. And one question that I think people often have is whether there are any differences in testing products that are made in a dedicated gluten-free facility versus those that are made in a shared facility. Laura, do you want to jump in on that one?
Well, how you actually test may not be any different, but what you test may be a little different. As Justin just mentioned, you're probably not as concerned with equipment swabbing perhaps as you are with your raw materials that are coming into the facility. So, or
in a dedicated facility.
Yeah, in a dedicated facility. If you're not running anything gluten containing on the equipment, you're probably not as prone to worry about doing equipment testing for those.
So it becomes just a judgment call really by the manufacturer again.
Yeah, and like they mentioned, it's part of your risk assessment. You've taken out a lot of risk then by operating a dedicated facility, so hopefully that reduces then the level of testing you need to do.
As long as you're testing your incoming products. Sometimes a certificate of analysis, isn't enough. You might get a certificate of analysis saying that the product is below 20 parts per million or 10 parts per million, but oftentimes it's good practice to confirm that.
So testing ingredients, in other words, like if you're in a dedicated facility and you're bringing in ingredients that are presumably gluten-free, you're saying you might still want to do some testing of those ingredients.
Absolutely, especially with something like oats or grains.
Yeah, it's an important part of, everybody should have sort of a vendor approval process until you find suppliers that you really trust. You might do, if you get a new supplier, you might do more testing up front with them till you kind of feel good about their processes for getting you gluten-free ingredients.
Yeah, and we see it in both directions. We have manufacturers who have gluten-free facilities who say, our supplier said this is gluten-free, it's below 20 ppm, but they did a rapid test and it was positive. And it was still below 20 and everything was okay, but they had to do that confirmation. We also have people who something comes in that's gluten-free, meaning at least under 20, and they do a rapid test in-house and it comes up positive. And so there's often confirmations, and then going back to what you said before about the follow-up testing to determine really what are the levels if you get a positive hit on a rapid test, and the differences between different tests. The supplier may have tested with one test, and the manufacturer may receive it, use a different test, and they say, why do I have two different results? So it all comes back to all the questions you've asked, basically.
Yeah. So I just want to kind of circle back to, is a product that's labeled gluten-free, does that mean it's always been tested? And I know we've answered that at the outset, but I think, we hear that question so often from consumers. So, I mean, the answer really is no, it hasn't always been tested. And I think that's just really a misconception on the part of a lot of consumers. Well, it's something to be aware of. It doesn't mean there aren't.
Oh, I was going to say, there's a lot of times you can't test. So earlier you had brought up the idea of fermented and hydrolyzed products. Yeah. The recent or last year's FDA ruling about fermented and hydrolyzed products basically says you can't test those. The proteins have been broken down. They can fool the test kits basically into thinking that the sample's negative. So you have to have other ways to document up front that material was gluten-free, before you then use it in a gluten-free finished product. And that's it's a fairly progressive US regulation. We actually came out with something before somebody else did, but other countries aren't yet looking at it that way. In Europe, it's still, well, if it tests at 20 ppm, you're good to go and it's gluten-free. But yeah, so different countries' regulations sort of play into it too.
Yeah. But so it's all that risk assessment and everything else, but not everything. When you pick up a product that says gluten-free, it's not necessary. It hasn't necessarily been tested, but that doesn't mean that it's not safe. I just think that testing is something that is often sort of latched onto as, is it tested? Because I guess it's we like to have that sort of concrete, sort of easier to grasp answer, as opposed to all the complexities of different kinds of tests and what are they calibrated for, and et cetera. But it's complicated stuff.
It checks off a box on your risk management.
Yeah. So I would like to get into test kits for use by consumers in a second. But before we do that, we're going to put up just one quick question, a pop-up poll that we'd like all of our attendees to answer. Gino put that up just to give us a sense of where people stand on this. Okay, interesting. So 17% yes, have tested their food for gluten, and 83% no. Interesting to know. May or may not be representative of a larger group of gluten-free consumers. But I think it's just interesting to keep in mind as we go into this next section of our discussion. So lateral flow, or the rapid kits that we've been talking about, let's see if we can, are used by consumers. How long has it been now that rapid kits have been available to consumers? Can one of you answer that question?
At least a decade or so.
About a decade, yeah.
They've been available for, I think, about 12 to 15 years, but not initially to consumers.
Right.
Years are a little bit more limited.
Yeah. So what type of validation should be expected with these kits to ensure that they are accurate and reliable? If you're a consumer and you think, oh, great, I am going to get one of these kits, and next time I go to my neighbor's house for dinner, I'm going to just do a little test to make sure. I Are they necessarily good to go? How are these kits validated, and how reliable are they? Who wants to
Well,
jump in?
Go, Luke.
Yeah, I was going to say, at the minimum, hopefully, I guess it's a high level, but an AOAC performance tested method validation, which isn't specific to consumer products, but at least is a, high bar, saying that for the matrices they claim, it is accurate to what it says it does. I know there is a document for AOAC certification of consumer product testing LFDs, but I don't think any kit has met those yet. I could be wrong.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to throw this out there for our attendees. AOAC is the Association of Official Agricultural Chemists,
It's got a few different names.
right?
Yeah, it was that. Now they just call themselves AOAC. Yeah. Now,
Okay.
Yeah, they dropped the acronym. I think one of the most recent was Association of Official Analytical Chemists at one point.
Yep.
But yeah, their website does have a description. I don't remember what the current phrasing is, but I believe it's just AOAC.
Okay.
You're
Well,
just
just to,
switching it.
for people who haven't heard of it, to give them some sense of what that means and what the organization is.
Yeah, so in an AOAC validation, like Luke mentioned, they're doing a lot of work on different food types, like the types that they're going to claim the kit is suitable for. You hope they include, if you're going to do a cookie, you hope they're testing an actual baked cookie, with a known amount of gluten in it. But you also want to see them do things like, the robustness of the kit. Can you vary the parameters or how an end user might use it and see if you still get the right results? Have you done, storage conditions and those kind of things? Have you checked the shelf life of the kit and, make sure that that's good? So there's a lot of stuff that goes into a validation. And again, through AOAC, you're always at least having one independent lab give you data on that kit too. So for us in GFCO, those are the kits we require people to use, is anything with an AOAC or the AACC, which isn't what they go by anymore, but the Serial Chemist organization also does some kit validation.
So if a consumer is wanting to do home testing, they should seek out ideally a kit that has been validated.
I think every kit is going to have some sort. I would be shocked if there's a kit that does not have a validation. It's just the level of validation that you're seeking will vary. And I would say, so since there would be there's presumably validations for all of them to some extent.
Okay.
That's probably available. The thing to look for would be something in that validation that is similar to the product that you're testing. That would be, especially if there's something specific you want to test a cookie. Does this validation include cookies or ingredients that you would find in cookies so that you know that this test would or should work on that product? Because a validation isn't going to cover every possible food product that exists.
So say you're a consumer and, you want to test your chocolate chip cookies. Can you easily find that information when you're setting out to acquire a home test kit?
If there's a PTM on it, yes. Otherwise, you're going to have to do some digging or ask the manufacturer, and hopefully they would have that information readily available.
Ask the manufacturer of the test kit.
Yeah.
Keep in mind, some of these rapid tests that have PTM approvals aren't really meant for consumer uses. So, you might not come with everything you need, or they might be more made for swabbing verification at manufacturer levels.
I guess what I'm wondering is, for a consumer who's, not particularly well versed in this stuff, but wants to use one of these tests, is there a way to know, whether what the test you're using is sufficiently validated for your purposes?
Yep, you might have to do some.
Not easily.
Not easily.
Yeah,
Not easily.
we can give people the link to aoac.org and they can, where you can look for those, but that's what we would like people to do. That would be the safest thing for people to do. But you understand that's not, not a website most people know off the top of their head.
Right.
And as Luke pointed out, when it comes to test kits that home users can use, those generally don't have PTM certifications on them.
Would you explain what PTM certification is?
So PTM is performance tested method. It's a certification established by AOAC Research Institute. It is a requirement, as Laura mentioned, either said what used to be called AACC or AOAC certifications required for GFCO to submit results for certifications. It requires, as I think Luke mentioned already, it requires a third-party testing. Mm-hmm. So there has to be an independent lab that's gone over that. So it's a fairly high-level validation that you would normally see on a home kit.
Okay. So last part of my question on home test kits is, how should consumers interpret both positive and negative results?
A grain of salt. If it's a positive result, it's probably positive unless you have something fairly complex in there. A negative result, it could be negative. It could be, the matrix is interfering. You're not actually extracting the proteins. You could be missing the, sampling becomes a huge issue if you have a plate of, mashed potatoes, gluten-free biscuits, and meat, choosing which components to test.
Right. And even in sort of a more mixed food, say it's all, one side dish that, it looks sort of homogeneous, it still isn't necessarily homogeneous when you're right.
My follow-up question is always, why are you testing? What is the, not like, why are you doing this, but what is the purpose of your testing?
Yeah.
If you're testing for peace of mind, a negative result tells you everything that you're ever going to learn. And that may be all you need to see. If you're testing for to determine if there's gluten present at all, you may need to do multiple tests. A positive result is often much more conclusive than a negative result. But it gets back to what is the purpose of the test that you're running? And is it I want to test my entire plate of food, which makes it very difficult, or is it I want to test the breading on my chicken parmesan because they told me it's gluten-free, and that's the highest risk thing that I've got in my dish right now.
Okay, yeah, good information. Interesting. Thank you. Laura, anything else to add on how to interpret those positive and negatives?
Well, I very much agree. You do have to take that with a grain of salt. You do have to keep in mind that, every lab report comes with a little statement saying these results only apply to the exact amount of sample basically that we tested. You have to, you have to keep in mind, maybe you hit, as we talked about earlier, hot spots. Maybe you hit that one hot spot, but there's nothing really wrong with the rest of the plate. Or maybe you hit the cold spot and there's other things you should worry about. And so, yeah, it's hard really, for consumers. It's almost like you want to build up maybe a history of testing with products that you like. It's almost the way manufacturing works. You build up a history of negative tests. You learn to trust your process. On a consumer end, it may be learning to trust with a combination of, trying the products and some testing over time to make sure that that's a product you can keep purchasing.
Yeah. I think that's interesting too, but I also think that consumers are often using kits when they are at a restaurant or, as going to a friend's house or even that sort of thing. So I think that makes it even trickier still.
Yeah, and it does get tough. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of times the rapid kits are a little more sensitive on purpose because they're screening results. And if consumers are using those and regularly going, well, I'm never going to buy that product again because it tested positive on me, at some point, you're discouraging manufacturers from making gluten-free products. So you kind of have to worry about that side of it too. Do you want to limit choice, for overly sensitive kits?
Right. Sort of look at the big picture. Yeah.
Yeah, we do have a lot of people, because we're also a manufacturer, we have people ask us, oh, do you have something less sensitive that we can use? because as a manufacturer, a lot of them don't want to know if it's 5 parts per million. They just want to know it's negative, below their threshold. If they get a positive below their threshold, then they're required to do that follow-up testing that you're talking about. So it's a bit
interesting
work.
Yes. There's just so many, layers to this. It's pretty complex.
To follow up on that point from Justin, the trick is that, given your food type, your kit may only test at 10 ppm in a certain food type, but it might see at 2 ppm. And, lateral flows look like an on-off switch, but there's a little fuzzy area there in the middle where they're, depends on the kind of food you're testing.
If you're going to have 100% sensitivity at a certain level, you're going to have some amount of detection below that also.
On matrix as well, in some cases.
Complicated stuff. I wanted, since we have Laura here, who is with the GFCO program, to just give us a brief overview of how testing works within GFCO. We can sort of get her a little slightly more firsthand information.
Yeah, I mean, every company that makes GFCO certified products is required to do some level of testing. It is very risk-based, and it's, the kind of thing where if you're a dedicated facility, we're still going to assign you testing for your high-risk ingredients coming in. We're probably not going to have you do equipment swabbing because you're not changing over between gluten-containing and gluten-free. And you're going to have then some level of finished product testing. And all of it's based on the risks in your plant. So then if you're a mixed use facility, you'll have still be testing your high-risk ingredients come in. If you're not sharing equipment, if your gluten-free is actually in another room, but in the same building, you may not do that equipment testing, but your finished product testing is going to be a little higher. So it just kind of scales up like that. If you then move on to, you're using shared equipment at some point, you've got your raw material testing you're doing for anything high risk. You are then doing a lot of swabbing on your changeovers to your gluten-free products. And you're then even going to have a higher level of finished product testing to do. So it's all very, very risk-based. Again, we're not getting anybody to a statistical level of testing. I think we would lose a lot of gluten-free manufacturers, and it's just, it's.
Wait, what do you mean by that?
So we're not testing to a point where I can tell you with, 95% confidence, I've tested enough samples to know that absolutely zero of them are going to have, gluten above 10 ppm. The number of samples you would have to do to get to that sort of 95% confidence is just unrealistic in a manufacturing situation. People just aren't going to do it. You get to do more statistical level sampling if you're doing an investigation. If you've had an incident, you're going to do an investigation, you're going to do then quite a few more samples. But that's why we don't certify based on testing. Testing shouldn't be how you know your products are gluten-free. It's really just a check, but we do want you to check a little more if there's more risk in your facility.
And this brings to mind just a somewhat separate question, but what is the lowest level of gluten that can be tested for? Because it's not zero. Am I right?
We test down to 2.5 parts per million. I know there's some tests that get the test down to 3.
They updated it to 1. They determined the LOD is like 1 parts per million.
Yeah, there's actually, Japan has a specific gluten-free rice regulation that's 1 ppm. So I think the Morinaga kit in that specific matrix can go down to 1 ppm.
Interesting. I mean, the FDA 20 parts per million level was set certainly in large part because it was extrapolated that amount would be safe for most people. So, there may not be reason to generally test to that lower level, although I don't know, maybe things will move in that direction.
As limits for the allergens are developed, we'll see if that target moves. Yeah. But we're a ways from that in the US.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think it is time to get to questions. So I'm going to introduce Jeannie Reed, our marketing manager, who should be coming on screen. There she is. Thank you, Jeannie. And she has been compiling the questions. And we'll now start to read them out.
Okay. Hi, everyone. First question is, in ELISA testing, is it difficult to isolate gluten from the biochemical matrix? or all the other non-gluten parts that might interfere with the reaction?
Generally, no. There's a couple things that interfere, as we mentioned earlier, tannins and polyphenols and things like that. And most or all kits have an option for adding other components to address that, whether it's skim milk powder, BSA, PVP, things like that, that can take care of most of the things that would interfere. So generally, it's not generally something that can prevent testing.
But interestingly enough, it is sort of, because part of the definition of gluten is it's not water soluble. So it's easy now because people have figured out the chemical means to get it into solution. But yeah,
Good point.
Just starting from scratch, if someone just wanted to try to do it, it's
so if you're making your own test kit, keep that in mind.
Great. Do analytical instruments such as mass spectrometry have any potential for lab usage?
Maybe on the research end. I mean, it's pretty complex at this point. Definitely ELISAs are a pretty well-rounded tool for what we're doing, especially on, mass spectrometers, especially on the hydrolyzed, gluten end, can be used for research, but I don't know of any labs that are doing it for routine analysis. It would be extremely expensive.
And is the IgG ELISA 96 test for food allergies reliable?
For food allergies?
Food allergy.
Oh, so like the blood test, looking to see if you have
Am I allowed to say that bluntly?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, they're not.
You mean, so are they talking, I guess you can't tell from the question, but are they talking about like the blood tests you're doing, the IgG ELISAs you do to see if you have celiac disease, or?
If it's an allergen test, that's how
Yeah.
I was interpreting the question.
Oh, okay.
Or sorry, allergen. Sorry.
Mhm.
Determine sensitivities and
Okay. So, so one question is, how reliable are rapid test results compared to ELISA results? And I know you talked a little bit about this before, but I think it's a kind of repeated question.
On what you're testing. I mean, some things, the ELISA, you have a more robust extraction procedure. Generally you'll have reducing agents and longer, heated extraction times. So if you have a really complex matrix, it could potentially, be a lot more reliable on the ELISA. But certain things, I think the rapid tests work essentially just as well. I don't know if you have different experience with that. I mean, certainly there are some matrices where a rapid test is just as good, at their best, for sure. Some things, not so much.
Yeah, we don't run into a lot of things where the rapid kits have a problem. I know, Justin, you pointed out a lot of the things that can hang them up, but in most food types, they do pretty well.
yeah, we get things like really, really fine powders, things that turn into gels when liquid is added to them. You get some weird things like that. Laboratories have more ability to tweak the extractions and find workarounds to get gluten or what may contain gluten out of a sample, and also to validate it for that matrix if it's a problem.
Great. There are two questions that I'm going to ask together. This is actually, does GFCO list the tests qualified for FDA audit? And can we share the list of acceptable test kits used by manufacturers?
No, GFCO doesn't get to tell the FDA which tests they use, but they didn't mean to, but when they put out the first draft of the gluten-free regulation, they listed the kits they used for confirmatory purposes. They then took it out when they published the final rule, but they kind of tipped their hands. GFCO maintains a list of what we consider to be our approved test kits, and they're the ones that have gone through AOAC or AACC validation. We don't generally put that out to the public. But it's publicly available information. I suppose we could share it with somebody.
maybe we can put a link to that when we do a follow-up blog post, just
Yeah.
for information if someone's really interested in that information. We do have some manufacturers on tonight.
Yeah.
All right, so are there test kits you can travel with to test? And what's this rapid test for gluten? I know we talked a little bit, we talked a bit about that, but are there specific ones? Some people were asking if they're confused about what to get, and could we rate them? Rate any particular brands?
I'm not allowed to rate them. I've held my tongue on a few questions.
I will put in the rating of I only know one that's on our approved kit list that is sold for public use. So if anybody wants to see that list, they will find that there's one on there that is sold to the public.
Yeah, I believe there are 4 test kits that are sold to the public for home use. At least 2 are represented on here between the panel and the attendee list.
Okay, great.
And I think those are all shelf stable for using outside.
Yeah.
Using anywhere.
Okay. So if people are confused as what to get, perhaps we can put the approved test kit list. When we'll have a follow-up email afterwards where we'll send a recording of this, and you can see what falls under the approved test kits, the GFCO program.
Yeah, like I said, it's not really giving away any great mystery. You could go on aoac.org and look them up, but this just saves you the step.
Great. Is there a database of companies that only sell products with no gluten? That's like a dream.
There are multiple databases that people put together. They're all mostly just individuals that have made them or have a company that lists that sort of stuff. I don't know if there's any one that I'm familiar with that I recommend or anything like that, especially not here. But there are some lists that people have, blogs or whatever, they've just started putting things together, try to make an app so that when you go out you can find things, but I don't think any of those are exhaustive at all.
Yeah, I mean, our certification has a list of certified stuff, but it's certainly not an exhaustive list.
So here's one. Is the 10 or 20 parts per million based on the ability to detect? For a celiac patient, is any gluten activating the autoimmune process? Where did those numbers come from?
Yeah, the 20 ppm in the FDA regulation, they stated was an analytical threshold. It was the best, validated testing level at the time. And GFCO uses the 10 ppm because, well, actually GFCO started before the FDA regulation came out, but there were kits out that were detecting down at 10 ppm when GFCO began. But parts per million is a different thing than how many milligrams of gluten someone can tolerate a day. Most studies have said people can tolerate up to 10 milligrams of gluten per day safely if you have celiac disease. So a ppm is a milligram per kilogram. So if everything you ate was contaminated at 10 ppm, you could eat 2.2 pounds of food a day that was contaminated at that level and still be fine, supposedly, is the idea there. I don't know in the United States how many pounds of food we eat a day. Might be more than 2.2, I'm not sure. But hopefully everything isn't contaminated right at 10 ppm. Throw a vegetable in there. Yeah.
And someone was wondering, they've always wondered if animals that are fed with wheat, barley, and rye can still have gluten in them when it becomes meat. And is there any way to test out of that situation?
So you would get in circulation, you can get proteins that have been absorbed through the digestive tract. And so you do get fragments of that. That's what you detect when you do an IgG blood test, just detecting what you've eaten. As far as incorporating into the meat, I do not believe you would have those fragments intact anymore, integrated into the animal tissue. I suppose there's a chance you could have some in circulation in the bloodstream. But that would be a very small amount, and it would only remain in tissues that contained a large amount of blood at that point.
So watch out on the blood sausage consumption.
Yeah, I guess that's about it. I wouldn't drink too much animal blood.
Yeah.
That's the case.
Well, they have shown it can carry through to milk, but not many people are feeding cattle wheat because it's an insanely expensive way to feed cattle. So.
Interesting. Okay, great. And a GFCO question about oats and oat flour and our testing protocols. If there are specific testing protocols. And
how do we recommend people test oats or oat products for our clients?
yes, and if there was any modifications.
Yeah, so if you're an oat manufacturer, we actually like to see them use visual examination while they still have whole groats, because that's probably that is a statistical level of testing. You can look at enough to give yourself, a 95% chance that there's nothing over a certain, for us, it has to be less than 1 gram in every 4 kilograms of oats. That's well below our 10 ppm threshold. But it works out best for keeping you from, it's a less than 1% chance of getting a whole grain in a serving size. And 1 grain is only about 4.5 milligrams of gluten in it, one wheat grain. So would still be then safe under that supposed 10 milligram threshold that has been shown in double-blind placebo-controlled studies. So that is our preference when people are doing flours. Those are generally homogenized a little better, and you're not going to run into, you can still get hot spots. Some parts are going to be higher than others, but as long as all of that is staying below our 10 ppm threshold, then, that works for our certification.
Great.
Maybe a couple more, Jeannie?
I'm tossing it back to you, Lola. Looks like we're at the top of the hour.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you to Laura, Luke, and Justin, all 3 of you, for a very informative session. I think, if we've learned more about testing, and particularly that there is sort of a lot to it, and it's very complicated. So, you're learning more, but in a way, you're just learning that there's a lot more to know. But that's good to know. So we know that it's complicated. One result does not necessarily mean anything, depends on a lot of factors. And we know that you don't get safe products by testing. It's just sort of a final tool and a screening tool. And we talked a little bit about validation and how important validation is for test kits and for consumers who are using test kits. So as mentioned, we will be sending out the recording of this for those who would like to refer to it again. Before you sign off, we're going to ask you to fill out this or answer this one question that will help us in planning future events. Just take a moment and
I guess as the panel, we're not allowed to answer them.
Dilution of our responses.
I get you.
And then Jeannie, you are going to say a few more words, I think, and then we'll wrap things up. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you all for joining our event tonight. Thank you to our panelists. We really appreciate your time. This is a complex issue, and it really matters to those of us in the gluten-free community who want to understand how you keep, how manufacturers keep our food safe. So we really do appreciate this. As a nonprofit, the Gluten Intolerance Group is always working to make life easier for everyone living gluten-free, and we love being able to do free events like this. Events like this do take a lot of resources, and we always appreciate the support of our community. So this time of year, we're all in the giving is on our minds. Please do consider GIG in your year-end giving plans. At this time, we're working hard to support families facing food insecurity by providing safe food. So keep us in mind. Visit us at gluten.org if you're interested. And thank you again for attending. We hope to see you all again at the next event.